The wedding should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the most terrifying. But let me take you back to the moment when everything shifted from joy to horror, like the air turning cold in an instant. I was sitting at the head table beside my new husband, my hand intertwined with his, both of us basking in the warmth of the day. The hall was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of applause after the toasts. It all felt perfect, like something out of a dream. The air was sweet, everything so meticulously arranged, each flower, every piece of the ceremony planned to perfection. The night was ours and we were untouchable. Nothing could ruin this day. The speeches were over, and now it was time for the groomsmen to have their turn. They stood up one by one, delivering their jokes and teasing my husband with funny stories from his past. Everyone laughed, and for a moment, I felt like I was in a bubble, surrounded by the people I loved most, safe and happy. But just as the applause died down, something unexpected happened. The door opened. At first, no one noticed the man who walked in, dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, his expression polite but distant. He didn't speak immediately, but instead he held up a plain, unremarkable box wrapped in neat brown paper. The kind of package you'd expect from a delivery service. I couldn't explain it, but something about it didn't feel right. I didn't understand why, but I noticed it immediately. It wasn't part of the plan. A server rushed over, taking the box from his hands. The room had fallen silent, curiosity hanging thick in the air. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Who sent this? The question floated around unanswered. The note attached was simple, written in looping handwriting, but what it said made my heart stutter in my chest. With all my heart for the happiest couple. I looked at my husband, my brow furrowing, but he just shrugged. Neither of us recognized the handwriting. At first I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the groomsmen had something planned. Just a little joke, a surprise gift. But why the secrecy? "Open it!" someone yelled from the crowd. The voices a mix of amusement and anticipation. My husband and I exchanged a quick glance. Neither of us knew what to expect, but we agreed to open it anyway. The server carefully unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a plain, nondescript cardboard box. My breath caught in my throat, a cold, unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. Something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed to grow heavier around me. The box was unremarkable in every way, yet my heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As the server popped the lid open, it felt like time itself slowed down. My eyes focused on the inside, but it took a few seconds for my brain to register what was happening. And then, everything fell apart. A scream split the air, the kind of scream that rips through you and freezes you to the core. Someone dropped their glass. Inside the box was my dog. No, not just my dog, what was left of him. Max, my golden retriever puppy, the one my husband had given me for our anniversary 2 years ago. The tiny, joyful creature I had loved so much. His fur was matted with blood, his body twisted in ways I can't even begin to describe. The room erupted in chaos, but I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I felt numb, detached, as though I were watching it all unfold from a distance. The laughter, the joy, everything blurred into background noise. People screamed. Some were crying. Others scrambled to shield their children from the horror. And still I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that box, from Max. Why? Why him? My husband's voice cut through the chaos, snapping me out of my trance. Who would do this? His voice was shaking, his face pale with fear. I couldn't answer. My legs felt like lead, and all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing. Who would do this? The police arrived shortly after, and the box was taken away. The party, once filled with laughter and celebration, had turned into a nightmare. I remember the quiet murmurs of the guests as they tried to steer the evening back to some semblance of normalcy. But how do you recover from something like that? One by one, guests began to leave, some with heartfelt condolences, others just stunned into silence. The rest of the night was a blur. The laughter, the dancing, the happiness. It was all gone, replaced by the thick, suffocating air of horror that seemed to cling to everything. The next day, I received a call from the police. They had found fingerprints on the box. Someone had touched it. Someone who had been too careless to wipe it clean. And those fingerprints led them to a name I never thought I'd hear again. My husband's ex-girlfriend. Apparently, she'd been stalking him for months, watching his every move on social media, commenting on his posts, liking every picture. And somehow, she had found Max, the one thing that we both loved with all our hearts. She knew how much he meant to me, to us. She had sent the box. She had sent Max. The police explained that she'd been planning this for weeks, carefully crafting the perfect moment to destroy what we had. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach as they explained how she'd tracked down Max, taking him from our home when he went missing a few days before the wedding. We had thought he'd wandered off, maybe chasing after something. We'd put up flyers, asked around the neighborhood. Never in my wildest nightmares did I think someone had taken him on purpose. Looking back, there were signs. There were cryptic texts my husband had gotten from an unknown number, comments on his social media posts that seemed harmless at first, but now felt like a warning. But we had dismissed them, assuming they were just random trolls or the kind of harmless internet nonsense you encounter every day. But none of that mattered now. I kept replaying that moment over and over in my head, the image of that box, the twisted body of Max, and the horrifying realization that we had been watched, tracked, and manipulated. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's this. Trust your instincts. When something feels off, don't ignore it. And maybe, just maybe, some things are better left off social media. To this day, I can't hear the words wedding surprise without my stomach twisting. Every time I see a box wrapped in brown paper, my heart races. Some memories never fade, and some horrors, once they find you, never truly let go. The wedding cake glistened under the soft glow of fairy lights, an immaculate three-tiered masterpiece adorned with delicate sugar flowers. To the gathered crowd, it seemed like the pinnacle of perfection, a symbol of everything the day represented: love, beauty, and happiness. But beneath the flawless exterior, something dark waited, hidden and unsuspecting. I remember standing just a few feet away, holding a champagne flute, my laughter blending with the chatter around me. My cousin Clara and her new husband Mike stood by the cake, their smiles radiant. Clara's dress sparkled as she leaned into Mike, both of them ready to cut into the cake that everyone had been admiring all evening. The crowd cheered as the caterer rolled the cake closer on a rustic wooden cart, its wheels creaking slightly against the wooden floor. Phones were out, cameras flashing, everyone eager to capture the moment. The ornate cake knife, wrapped in a satin ribbon, rested on a silver tray beside the cake. It was the kind of detail Clara obsessed over, ensuring every aspect of the wedding screamed elegance. "All right, you two, make it a clean cut," someone from the crowd joked. "No pressure," another teased, prompting light laughter. Mike picked up the knife, his fingers brushing Clara's as they held it together. Their smiles widened as they leaned in, ready for the ceremonial slice. And then it happened. The moment the knife pierced the cake, a sharp crack echoed through the room. Mike's hand jerked back, and for a split second, confusion rippled across his face. Then came the blood, a vivid, shocking crimson against the pristine white fondant. It dripped onto the tablecloth, staining the perfect scene with something raw and visceral. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by a high-pitched scream. Clara's expression shifted from joy to horror as she grabbed Mike's arm, her eyes wide. "Mike, what happened?" Mike swore under his breath, clutching his hand, the knife still embedded in the cake. But it wasn't the ornate knife he had been holding. No, this blade was different. Someone pulled it out, revealing a long, sharp kitchen knife, the kind chefs use to chop vegetables, its steel glinting menacingly under the lights. It had been hidden, wedged deep inside the cake. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some rushing forward to help, while others stood frozen in shock. Clara's voice cracked as she pleaded for someone to call an ambulance. Mike's best man grabbed a napkin, trying to staunch the bleeding as Mike's face contorted in pain. "What the hell is this?" someone yelled, pointing at the knife. The caterers stood off to the side, their faces pale and blank with disbelief. The head chef, a wiry young man who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped forward hesitantly, his hands trembling. It, it was a joke, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the commotion. I didn't think... A joke, Clara's father bellowed, his face red with fury. You call this a joke? The chef's eyes darted around the room, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I thought it'd be funny. When they cut into it, they pull it out and... I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, I swear. But no one was listening. The damage was done. Mike's hand was bleeding profusely and he was starting to look pale. Clara was sobbing, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort him. The once lively reception hall had transformed into a scene of utter chaos. The police arrived before the paramedics. They questioned everyone, their presence adding to the surreal horror of the evening. The head chef was cuffed and led away, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of disbelief from the guests. Mike was rushed to the hospital, leaving behind a room full of stunned onlookers. The reception fizzled out after that. People tried to salvage the night, making small talk and attempting to dance, but the energy was gone. The fairy lights seemed dimmer, the music hollow. Clara's parents were livid, berating the catering staff as if yelling could somehow undo the nightmare. Later we learned that the knife had severed 2 tendons in Mike's hand. He required surgery and months of physical therapy, but even then, he would never regain full use of his hand. Imagine starting your marriage like that, carrying the weight of a horrific accident that could have been avoided. Clara tried to stay strong, but you could see the toll it took on her. She and Mike grew distant, their laughter quieter, their smiles less frequent. They didn't talk about the wedding much after that, as if burying it would erase the pain. The chef, last I heard, was charged with criminal negligence and assault. He claimed it was a stupid mistake, that he never intended to hurt anyone. Maybe that was true, but intentions didn't matter. The damage was permanent, etched into Mike's hand and their memories. Now, every time I see a wedding cake, I can't help but think about that day. It's funny how something so beautiful can hide something so sinister beneath its surface. And maybe that's the real horror of it all. You never really know what's lurking underneath. So, the next time you find yourself at a wedding, marveling at the perfection of it all, just remember, even the most flawless facade can hide something dark. And sometimes, the things you don't plan for are the ones that leave the deepest scars. The first thing I remember about Anna's wedding is the roses. Their scent was so overpowering, it felt like they were breathing, alive in the golden evening light that streamed through the ivy-covered venue just outside the city. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, the kind of perfection that makes you feel uneasy, like the calm before a storm. I was part of the bridal party, standing by with champagne in hand, enjoying the laughter and the clinking of glasses. Anna was radiant, her white dress glowing as if it was stitched with threads of sunlight. Eric, her groom, looked equally dashing. Together they seemed like a couple from a fairy tale. Yet there was something about that day. Something I couldn't shake. It was like an invisible thread of tension pulling tighter with each passing moment. Then he arrived. Nate, the photographer. Tall and scruffy, with an air of arrogance that filled the room the moment he walked in. He carried a massive camera strapped around his neck and a drone tucked under one arm. His confidence was palpable, almost unsettling. He barked orders at everyone like a director on a film set. You there, closer. Bride and groom, kiss again, but hold it longer this time. People grumbled under their breath but obeyed. After all, wasn't that what photographers were hired to do? Capture the magic, even if it meant faking a few smiles and posing awkwardly. But Nate wasn't like other photographers. As the day wore on, his behavior became strange. He muttered to himself, adjusting his gear obsessively. He climbed onto chairs for better angles, hopped down and darted across the room like a man possessed. His intensity was unsettling, as though he was chasing something elusive, a shot that would make him immortal. At one point I overheard him speaking to a venue staff member. The roof, he said, his voice tinged with urgency. I need access to the roof. Roof shots are killer. Trust me, it'll blow their minds. The staffer hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe they assumed Nate knew what he was doing. He was the professional, after all. But the roof wasn't designed for guests. It was a 3-story structure with sloped tiles, vents, and no guardrails. Just thinking about someone being up there gave me chills. A few minutes later, Nate vanished. I figured he'd given up on the idea. I went back to sipping champagne, trying to avoid my uncle's terrible dad jokes and soaking in the warm, festive atmosphere. The night carried on in a blur of music and laughter. When the slow song started, everyone turned their attention to Anna and Eric as they moved to the center of the platform for their first dance. It was magical, the kind of moment you see in movies. And then it happened. A crash. Loud, jarring, and wrong. It shattered the music, the laughter, the very air. Screams erupted, sharp and piercing. I spun around, my heart pounding, just in time to see the horror. Nate's body lay crumpled on the wooden platform, his camera shattered beside him. Blood pooled around his head, dark and vivid against the polished wood. His legs. They were bent in ways that no human body should ever bend. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Time itself held its breath. Then chaos erupted. Anna screamed, a guttural, heart-wrenching sound that echoed through the venue. Eric tried to hold her back, but his face was as pale as hers, his hands trembling. Guests rushed forward, some crying, others shouting for help. A few stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead as I stared at the broken man on the platform. His hand twitched, just once, a grotesque final spasm. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. Someone yelled to call 911, but it felt like an eternity before anyone moved to do so. Later, we pieced together what had happened. Nate had made it to the roof, determined to set up his drone for a sweeping shot of the dance floor below. But the sloped tiles were slippery, and there was nothing to stop him from falling. He must have lost his footing, plunging 3 stories onto the platform where Anna and Eric were dancing just moments before. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, but it was too late. Nate was gone. One of the EMTs muttered something about the fall being unsurvivable, not from that height, not with the way he landed. The wedding ended in a haze of tears and disbelief. Guests shuffled out, too stunned to say goodbye. Anna and Eric disappeared into one of the side rooms, their perfect day shattered beyond repair. I stayed behind, unable to leave, my mind replaying the crash over and over. The sound haunts me still, the sickening thud, the gasps, the screams. It's burned into my memory, a ghost that refuses to let go. In the days that followed, the incident made headlines. Wedding photographer's tragic fall became the talk of the town. But behind the sensational headlines was a chilling truth. Nate's obsession with capturing the perfect shot had cost him his life. Anna and Eric tried to move on, but the tragedy cast a shadow over their marriage. They don't talk about the wedding much anymore. The playlist from that night is locked away. The scent of roses now a trigger for tears. Their wedding day, meant to mark a new beginning, became a day they'd forever associate with death. And me? I can't look at wedding photos the same way again. Every time I see a photographer climbing for a better angle, my chest tightens. Every time I hear laughter at a wedding, I'm reminded of how quickly joy can turn to horror. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: some moments aren't worth the risk. No photo, no matter how perfect, is worth a life. The late afternoon sun painted the lake in hues of gold and crimson, and the air buzzed with the laughter of people basking in what felt like a perfect day. But perfection is often a fragile illusion, and sometimes it shatters without warning. It started with a hum, faint, almost imperceptible at first. I stood on the sidelines watching as the newlyweds posed for photos on an empty country road near the lake. The photographer had everyone lined up, the bride's radiant smile matched only by the groom's elation. Bridesmaids giggled, groomsmen cracked jokes, and the air seemed alive with joy. Yet beneath it all, a sound began to creep closer. A low, rumbling hum, distant but growing. I turned my head instinctively, trying to place it. A car, maybe? It didn't seem out of the ordinary at first. After all, roads are for cars. But as the noise grew louder, something about it felt off. Too sharp. Too fast. My chest tightened, though I couldn't explain why. Then it came into view. A car tearing down the narrow, gravel-lined road as if the devil himself was behind the wheel. It swerved slightly as it approached the bend, spitting up dust and gravel in a frenzied spray. The laughter around me faltered. Heads turned. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" At that moment, the photographer raised his hand, gesturing for everyone to stay in formation. "Let them pass," he said casually, snapping another photo as if nothing was amiss. But they didn't pass. The car veered closer, and a collective gasp rippled through the group. Someone shouted, "They'll stop!" But they didn't. In the split second before impact, I saw the driver's face through the windshield. A pale, vacant expression, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Then he jerked the wheel, aiming directly at us. The sound of impact is something I'll never forget. Screams, the sickening crunch of bodies hitting metal, the shattering of glass. And then silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the world had stopped. When my mind caught up to reality, the scene before me was pure chaos. The car had come to a grinding halt 20 meters down the road, its front end crumpled like paper, the windshield a spider web of shattered glass. Smoke curled from the hood as the driver stumbled out, swaying on his feet. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. The bridesmaids were sprawled on the road, motionless. One of them, Jenny, lay in an unnatural position, her limbs bent at angles no human body should endure. Her head rested on the gravel, and her hair fanned out around her like a grotesque halo. I knew immediately she was gone. Another bridesmaid, Katie, was beside her. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the white lace of her dress a vivid red. "Jenny! Katie!" someone screamed. No response. Their lifeless bodies remained still, an eerie contrast to the chaos erupting around them. The groom was on the ground, clutching his leg, which bent grotesquely at the knee. His suit was torn and blood seeped through the fabric. He called out desperately, "Emily! Emily!" searching for his bride. Emily, the bride, stood frozen in her white dress, her face pale as a ghost. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't hold her phone steady to call for help. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the carnage. Her dream wedding turned into a living nightmare. Tom, one of the groomsmen, lay unconscious near the edge of the road. Blood trickled down his forehead, pooling beneath him. His chest rose and fell faintly, a small mercy in an otherwise grim scene. Others were running, some to help, others in blind panic. The photographer dropped his camera and shouted for someone to call 911. But even as phones were pulled out, it felt like the world had slowed to an agonizing crawl. The driver leaned against the crumpled hood of his car, his face flushed and dazed. He muttered something incoherent, his words slurring together. "I didn't mean to. I didn't see. I was just celebrating." The stench of alcohol wafted from him, cutting through the acrid smell of burnt rubber and spilled gasoline. He tried to take a step forward but stumbled, falling to his knees. When the police and ambulances finally arrived, the scene had descended into quiet horror. The paramedics worked quickly, but it was too late for Jenny and Katie. They were pronounced dead at the scene. Tom was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical but stable. The groom, though in pain from his broken leg, refused to leave until Emily was safely escorted to a car. She hadn't spoken a word since the crash, her tear-streaked face locked in an expression of shock. The driver, a local farmer, was immediately taken into custody. Later we learned he had spent the afternoon at a nearby bar, celebrating a small harvest win. He downed drink after drink before deciding to drive home. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit. The reception, of course, was cancelled. Guests left in stunned silence, some wiping away tears, others too hollow to even say goodbye. I stayed behind, though I don't know why. Maybe it was the disbelief, the need to feel useful amidst the wreckage of a day that should have been beautiful. The decorations still fluttered in the breeze, mocking us with their cheerful colors. The chairs remained in neat rows by the lake, as if waiting for an audience that would never return. The photographer's camera, miraculously intact, sat abandoned on the ground. I picked it up, unsure of what to do. Out of curiosity, or maybe some morbid compulsion, I flipped through the photos he had taken earlier. They were beautiful, each frame capturing the joy and love that had filled the air just hours ago. But then, as I scrolled, my breath caught. The last photo he had taken wasn't of the group or the happy couple. It was of the car. Blurred, yes, but unmistakable. The vehicle hurtling toward us, its headlights glaring like twin eyes of some malevolent beast. My stomach turned, and I dropped the camera as if it had burned me. The days that followed were a blur of grief and questions. The families of the victims were inconsolable, their lives forever altered by one man's reckless decision. The groom, now confined to a wheelchair during his recovery, couldn't bring himself to talk about the wedding. Emily retreated from everyone, her once bright eyes now dull and distant. I couldn't shake the image of that car, the sound of the impact, or the sight of Jenny and Katie lying lifeless on the road. Every time I close my eyes, it's there, replaying in vivid detail. I've stopped driving on country roads. Hell, I've stopped attending weddings altogether. The idea of celebrating love and joy feels almost blasphemous now, knowing how quickly it can all be ripped away. There's a certain irony in it all. Weddings are supposed to be about beginnings, about hope and promise. But that day, all we were left with was an ending. A brutal, senseless ending that no one could have foreseen. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if we'd chosen a different venue, or if the photographer hadn't suggested using the road for photos. Would Jenny and Katie still be alive? Would Tom be free of the nightmares that now plague him? Would Emily and her husband have the chance to look back on their wedding day with fondness instead of horror? It's a pointless exercise, I know. What-ifs won't bring anyone back or change what happened. But the human mind is funny that way, always trying to rewrite the past, even when it's carved in stone. Now, whenever I see a wedding photo shoot on a road, my stomach twists. All I can think about is how fragile those moments are, how one wrong choice can unravel everything. It's a reminder I wish I didn't need. But maybe that's the cruelest part of life. The lessons it teaches are often the ones we'd give anything to forget. It started with the kind of perfection that felt unnatural. The sky was too blue, the air too still, and every smile looked just a little too wide. My cousin Lauren's wedding was a dream, or at least that's what everyone kept saying. A seaside venue perched atop jagged cliffs, waves crashing below like nature's applause. But sometimes dreams have shadows lurking just out of sight. Lauren looked stunning in her white dress, and Eric couldn't stop beaming. The ceremony was flawless, every detail planned to the second. But the real highlight? The photo session on a cliffside rock formation jutting over the ocean. Breathtaking, they called it. Dangerous, my gut whispered. The photographer, a hipster with a man bun and a camera worth more than my car, was buzzing with excitement. This spot will make the perfect shot. Trust me, he said, motioning to a flat, uneven rock near the edge. Lauren, Eric, just step out there. Something about the way the wind howled through the cliff set my teeth on edge. I wanted to say something, to shout, "Don't do it," but the words froze in my throat. Lauren hesitated, the hem of her dress brushing against the jagged stone. She glanced at Eric, who squeezed her hand and said, "We've got this." And they stepped out. The rest of us stood back, watching as the photographer adjusted his angles. "Turn a little to the left. Perfect. Now look at each other," he said, backing up to frame the shot. I couldn't stop staring at the rock. It looked brittle, fragile, like it could snap at any moment. "Just one more step back," the photographer said. The crack was sharp, like a gunshot. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Lauren's heel had shifted, and the rock beneath her splintered, jagged edges crumbling into the void below. Her head snapped around, eyes wide with panic. Eric shouted, "Lauren, move!" But it was already too late. The world seemed to slow down and speed up all at once. The stone gave way with a deafening grind, and Lauren screamed, a sound that pierced the soul. She clawed at the air, at Eric, but he missed her hand by a fraction of a second. She fell, her white dress billowing like a ghost against the blue sky. Then silence, just the relentless crash of waves below. We ran to the edge, peering over in disbelief. She was gone. Someone screamed to call 911, others collapsed into sobs. Eric fell to his knees, clawing at the dirt, his screams tearing through the stillness. The photographer stood frozen, his camera still aimed at the edge. By instinct or some twisted compulsion, he had captured everything. It took hours for the rescue team to retrieve her body, and by then, the sun was sinking into the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the cliffs. The medics said it was instant, that she hadn't suffered. But those words did nothing to erase the hollow emptiness left behind. Eric was shattered. He kept whispering, "I should have held her tighter," over and over like a mantra. None of us could find the right words. What could you even say? Then came the strangest part. A week later, the photographer handed Eric the footage. For closure, he said, as if watching the love of his life fall to her death would bring him peace. Eric never opened it. He shoved the USB drive into a drawer and left it there to rot. But the rest of us knew. The video existed, a cursed reminder of how quickly happiness can turn to horror. No one talked about it, but we all thought about it. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself wondering if the footage held something we missed. Something unnatural. Something that caused the fall. Because even now, when I think back to that day, I can't shake the feeling that the wind wasn't just wind, that the cracking rock wasn't just an accident. Moments are fragile, fleeting, and sometimes they slip away faster than we can hold on.